Alrighty, so we should be recording now. So before I get started, I just want to kind of show a real quick slide here regarding TAM Lab, and as we get this effort moving forward, if anyone else is interested and want to get more involved, we have these four social channels set up here. Headquarters is basically SharePoint at this point, so go out and search for that. The link is on the bottom right there. So that's my shameless plug for TAM Lab. So today we're going to be doing TAM Lab number 8, where Troy and I will be setting up Microsoft DFS or Distributed File System namespace in my home lab. And we'll talk about best practices and considerations, things like that. So from an agenda perspective, real quick, this is my last slide, I promise. I'm hoping, Troy, you can kind of provide some background around what was the ask from the customer and why we're doing this in the first place. I think they had a specific use case or some questions around maybe best practices. Then I'll do a quick kind of demo over, or high level, what am I trying to say? A high level explanation of DFS or Distributed File System. I'll show my lab and kind of a quick overview of what the lab looks like from a deployment configuration, I guess, perspective. And then we'll jump into the meat of it and getting into installing DFS and setting up a namespace, doing some folders, and then we'll talk about best practices. So again, this is meant to be interactive. So if you guys have questions or if you have thoughts, if you've got experiences that you've seen, just speak up. This is kind of meant to be an open discussion sort of forum. So let me jump out of the PowerPoint. I'll kill that. So Troy, do you want to kind of give us some background around what your customer was specifically asking? Because I think that's where this kind of all started from, right?
Yeah, so the customer ask is about using folder redirection and using DFS for replication. So they're looking to transition towards a VDI environment. Their desktops, they still have local folders where they're storing data, but they're moving towards redirecting that to a network location so that physical desktops are their My Docs and desktop and favorites and all that are now on a network location. They want to integrate that with VDI, so if they log into a VDI session from home, they have the same place, and the back end that they're looking at is DFS based. And I had gone out and was looking at that. UEM supports it. We seem to support it all the way through. But I was just looking at, are there complexities or any gotchas that I should throw out to them to take a look at? And really, the surprise to me and why I put the question out there is they actually have a large NetApp environment. And I was wondering why they would do a DFS scenario on a virtual server when they actually have this large array that they could use directly for folder redirection. And so when I went looking for DFS information, I didn't find anything specific on the newer versions of Windows, but like 2008, there was a lot of don't do this if you have a large volume of users, which they do.
Cool. Perfect. So very good. With that, let me just kind of jump in real quick and do a high-level overview of what DFS is. So Distributed File System, it's a Microsoft technology that is essentially embedded within their Windows operating system, right? So there's two different components, and Troy kind of touched on this. Let me jump into some of these links here. So there's the first component is what's called DFS namespace or DFSN, which is essentially a mechanism to mask file shares that are behind a common namespace, right? And you can see it here. There's a nice little diagram where users, instead of going directly to a server via a UNC path like // server name / share and then folders beyond that, they go to a namespace which is common to the domain if you're doing an Active Directory integrated mode, so to speak. And then we're able to configure whatever actual file shares are behind it, right? So the idea is if you're using this particular file share here and we need to decommission that because it's old or it's out of space and move it to here, it's going to have a new path, and that's going to break all the links for your users, which is an absolute nightmare, right? Because they may have scripts that call these UNC paths and it's a disaster. So that's where the DFS namespace can really help out. The other component to DFS is called DFS Replication, or DFSR, which works in conjunction with the namespace service, where it's able to replicate data from one file share to another file share and keep them in sync, basically. Like I said, you can use these two technologies together, or you can use them independently of one another. I know that's the case with namespace. You don't have to use DFS replication when you're using the namespace, and I'm fairly certain you can use DFS replication without using the namespace functionality. So this actually comes with an Active Directory domain controller. So if you have a domain controller, in fact, let me log into mine real quick. So I've got 3 of them. Well, before I do that, let me give you a little overview of my lab. So looking at vCenter, I've got 2 physical sites. So my home here in Elk Grove, and then I've got a home up in the mountains, and I've got 2 hosts up there. So 2 physical sites with a site-to-site VPN. So what's great about that is I've got 2 domain controllers in Elk Grove here, and I've got 1 in Arnold, and they're set up in the same domain, different sites, right? So when you think of a site, think of an Active Directory site. So that's really all we need to know from a lab overview perspective. We're not going to really get into vSphere a whole lot here, but if I log into DC01, which is here in Elk Grove, and we look at the services that are running, because this is a domain controller, should already have both the DFS namespace and the DFS replication running. So right here you can see they're already installed and running. And that, again, gets installed when you set up a domain controller. So a lot of the Active Directory synchronization of the database and the schema and all that sort of stuff, it's leveraging DFS under the hood. So let's see what's next. Any questions on DFS from a high level? Did I miss anything? Did I get anything wrong that you guys know? Okay. So we've reviewed the lab environment. So let's just jump right in. What I'm going to do is actually install the DFS management tools on my 3 domain controllers, because like I said, when I set up these as Active Directory controllers, it installed the services, but it did not install the management tools, right? So before I do that, let me jump over to this Word doc. I've put together some good links here that talk about some of the stuff that we're going to be going through today. So if we go back to here, this is a really good doc. This is their Microsoft documentation, right? So there's some good links in here around tuning, both the namespace as well as how to deploy it and then things like that. So that's a good resource. And then on TechNet, there's a gentleman by the name of Jose, I think it's Barreto, and he's written a bunch of blogs. He's kind of like the DFS product manager, I believe, and he's written some really good blogs here around just kind of what is DFS, what are the basics. There's some design considerations which really don't play into vSphere or virtualization much. It's pretty straightforward. This was a really good one. How many namespace servers do you need, right? These are the servers that are actually hosting the namespace. So as a client, if I'm requesting access to a file share, I go to the namespace, I'm going to hit this namespace server, right? And this talks about kind of how many do you want for redundancy purposes or performance. And then we'll get into some other best practices too. So let me log into all 3 of my domain controllers, and I'm going to install the management tools, like I said. So let me kick it off here on DC01. I'm just going to go to Server Manager. Let this load. We're going to go add roles and features. Actually, before I do that, let me log into the other 2 so they have a second to kind of log in. Okay, so back to DC01. So I'm going to do this on here. I guess I could do all 3 at the same time, but I'll just do them separately. So you're going to find this as a role under the file and storage services. If you dig down, here's my DFS namespace. So it's going to install the management tools. I'm not going to do replication today. It's kind of out of scope for this TAM lab. No features we need, so I'll click next. It won't need to restart because these are just the management tools. So we'll install. And we'll do the same on the other two here. All right, so hopefully that's done on DC01 or almost done. All right, so that succeeded. So I'm going to close this. I'll close Server Manager. And if we now go to our administrative tools, oops, we should have a new MMC snap in here for, oh, we should, where is it?
It's right there, DFS management, isn't it?
Oh, there it is. I'm blind today. Thank you.
No, they love to hide those.
No, that's pretty right in my face. All right, so if we launch that, you'll see we don't have much of anything at this point. We do have some replication just because this is a domain controller and it's leveraging that for the sysvol stuff. But again, we'll focus on the namespace. So I'm going to ignore Java. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a new namespace. So we'll click New Namespace. I'm going to do it on DC01. We're going to click Next. So here's where it wants to know the name of the namespace. Now, most organizations just use public, but you can do whatever you want here, really. Again, this is going to show up in the path, right? We'll have //, and if it's an Active Directory integrated configuration, you'll have the domain name. So in my case, it's tilkens.local, and then I'll have / namespace. In this case, it'll be public, right? So we'll click Next. Now here's where we're going to specify whether we want a standalone namespace or a domain-based namespace. I would highly recommend a domain-based namespace if you're using Active Directory anyways, because all the configuration is stored within Active Directory. If you do standalone, which you can do, you're not going to have any redundancy, right? So if you do a standalone, you should really set up 2 namespace servers and do a Microsoft failover cluster, which is a lot more complex. Typically, most companies just do domain-based, right? It's similar like a certificate services server. You could do a standalone CA, or you could do an enterprise CA, which is domain integrated. I would always recommend checking the Enable Windows Server 2008 mode. That's going to just improve a lot of the scalability features. They made a lot of enhancements with DFS and Windows Server 2008, specifically around replication. So, the ability to like throttle the replication from a bandwidth perspective, and I think they do it at the block level rather than the entire file level. So that's why you probably saw a lot of stuff. I think you mentioned that, Troy. You saw a lot of things around DFS with 2008 specifically, and I don't think there's been a lot of changes since then. So that's why there was a lot more, content back then. So I'm going to do this. Again, this is going to be the path, and we should be good. So we'll click Next. So just review our settings, click Create, and we're done. So now we have a new namespace, and right now the only server within that, the only namespace server is DC01. And what you'll notice here is the site is associated with it because it does leverage the Active Directory sites, and it does that for performance as well as availability, right? So if I'm a client and I'm requesting access to this file share that's behind a namespace, it's going to say, okay, your site, your computer, you're in Elk Grove, so I'm going to refer you to this namespace server. And then in addition to that, once we set up some folders, you could have multiple file shares behind a DFS folder, namespace folder. and they could be in different sites, and they're replicating maybe behind the scenes. And users in Elk Grove are going to get directed to the local file server in Elk Grove, whereas another site may go to that other site, right? So I'm going to add a couple more namespace servers to this namespace. So if I do DC, I'll just do DC, see what I find. I think I have to do one at a time, yeah. So I'll do DC02, we'll click OK. But while that's running, let's look at the C drive of DC01 here. You'll see that we now have this folder in the root of C called DFS roots, and that's where our namespaces are essentially hosted, right? So DC02 finished, you can see the site. Let's add the third one here. I'll make it capital just to be safe. And if I go to DC02, this finished. Well, I never confirmed that, but luckily it finished. And again, on the root of C, we should have that new folder with the DFS roots in it. All right, and 3 has been added as well, and you can see that's a different site. So any clients within that site, if they request a folder within this namespace, they're going to get redirected to DC03 for what's called the referral. So it basically refers you to whatever file servers you've got set up behind the namespace, right? So now that we've got that, we can actually add some folders here. So there's 2 types of folders we can add. We can do, let's call it home, for instance, and we can just say OK. Now this is just going to add to the structure of the file structure, right? There's nothing really behind it. It's not a redirect in any, it's just adding to it, and then you could add redirects within that. So that's the first type. It's basically just setting up your folder structure. Before I do that, let me log on to, I have another server here called utility, which is just a Windows server. It's a member of the domain, but it's not a domain controller. And I use this a lot for just random stuff like Power CLI and things like that. But I also set up some shares on here. So if we look under the C drive, I put a data folder, and then these 3 folders are shares, right? So think of these as department shares like finance, HR, IT. And if we browse to the UNC, we should see them as shares, right? Now, let's also check the services on this server real quick, because this is not a domain controller and I didn't set up DFS. So you notice we don't have DFS here. But if I wanted this to be a namespace server, it absolutely could be. I would just need to install that service. So I've got these 3 shares. So let's go back to, well, let me close this on DC3. Let me go back to DC1. All right, so here I'm going to set up a new folder. Let's call it finance. And then let's add a target behind it, right? So we'll add, I'll do a browse. And let's browse for a different server. Utility. Now it sees my 3 shares. So we started with finance, so we'll add finance. And that's basically it. Now I could add other folder targets, like I said, like if I had the same file share in both site A and site B, and they're replicating behind the scenes, you would add them both here, and then clients will get redirected based on which site they're in, right? So Troy, back to your customers use case, that would probably be pretty useful for them, right? If they've got VDI users, I don't know, maybe they've got VDI infrastructure in both sites. Probably not. It's probably in a centralized data center, so it's all local, right? I still think there's value in setting up a DFS namespace in front of like a NetApp CIF share, because if you ever needed to migrate that, you know, it's not really adding a lot of overhead, and it gives you a lot of flexibility. So we're going to click OK, and now you can see the two different types of folders that we have, right? This one is actually a redirect to a different file share altogether. This one is just a folder within the path. So now if we go to Windows Explorer and we browse to / tilkens.local, which is the domain name, public, which is our namespace, we can see both, right? So I could go into home and I would see whatever else I put within that. Or if I click on finance, it's going to show me whatever's in this folder, which is behind the scenes, actually the utility server, which has other shares on it. So if I put a file in here, and we'll call it troy.txt, and then we log into utility and look at our finance folder, local, right? So me as a client over here, this path now is completely abstracted from the actual file path, right? So that's the real power of it. What else? So we've set up our namespace, we've set up some folders. Let me do this as well. So if we go to, I have a file, a FreeNAS appliance running here. So just to show, we log into that and we create a CIFS share. Let's see. We'll add a new CIFS share in the volume 1 and we'll call it finance. I'll name it finance. I'm not going to get into permissions here, right? But you'd still have to deal with your share permissions and your NTFS permissions, just like you normally would when you're dealing with file shares. So, all right. So now we've got a new share here off of a NAS device. If I go back to DC01, I can add another target to this same folder. And we can, well, let's first make sure we can browse to it here. So if I open up a new File Explorer window and I go to / FreeNAS, there's my finance share. You'll notice there's nothing in it, right? Oops. So let's copy this. I'll put it here. So now it's giving us the option to set up a replication group, which is really the DFS replication component, because we're setting up multiple folders behind the same DFS folder in a namespace. So you would want to keep these two folders synchronized and replicated between one another. But if you're using like a NetApp CIFS share and you've got a NetApp array at both sites, maybe you're replicating, using that mechanism because it's probably more efficient than Microsoft's replication. So it's giving you the opportunity to set up a replication group. Do you guys want to do that or not? I mean, I wasn't going to cover replication here, but we can. I think we'll have time.
If you've got time, it would be great to see.
Okay, so let's do it. And it's just going to prompt us through it here. So it might not actually work because it's going to need to have the DFS replication service running. So it's making the assumption that this other file server is a Windows-based one. So it probably won't work now that I think about it. Right, yeah. And I don't have replication installed on utility, so I don't have it installed on either one of them. But we could do it with a different set. We'll do it, we got time. We'll do it between DC02 and DC03 because those are both Windows servers and they both have the replication service. So we'll set up another share here and we can go through that. But here again now, if I go to this path, which is I think this one, you can see I'm still getting redirected to the one that's on the utility server because it has this folder in it. But folks in the same site may get redirected to the other one, which doesn't have the same files on it, which is a problem because you would want them to be in sync, right? So let's add another folder here. Actually, before I do that, let's go to DC02 and we'll create a folder, or we'll create a share here on the root of C. We'll call this data. We'll do IT. How about that? Or let's do HR. And we'll create a share. Again, I'm just going to go full access. These are share permissions, not the NTFS permissions, but that's okay, just for the sake of our lab. So that share is set up. And actually, let me put a file in there too. New file. We'll call this file from DC02, right? So it originated there. And we'll put something in there, test. Okay. Now if we go over to DC03, which is over here, let's do the same thing. We'll create another share here, but this time I'm not going to put any folders in it, and we'll let replication replicate between the two. Oops. So again, we'll share it. Okay. Let's go back to DC01, and we're going to create a new folder. We'll call this HR, and let's add our folder paths. So we're going to do / DC02/HR. Let me copy that. And then we're going to add DC03. Oops. And click OK. Now we should be able to set up the replication group. So we'll say yes. It's going to validate that the service is running on both of those servers. Hopefully. And I guess I never validated that I could access those shares. So there's HR. There's our file. 03 HR with no files, right? All right, so that worked. So we're going to give it a group name. I'm just going to accept the defaults here. We're going to replicate the HR folder. They are both eligible. I can't even do anything here really. So we're good. So the primary member, so this is where you would select, where's your single source of truth. So if you had, let's say, a central data center and you've got a bunch of branch offices that you wanted to replicate to, you would select your data center, right? But the other point here being that DC02 has all the data that we want in it and we want to replicate it elsewhere, whereas DC03 doesn't have anything in it, or it's old data or something like that. So it's going to initially push everything from DC02. Here's your topology. The top one here, the hub and spoke, makes sense if you've got the scenario I just mentioned where you've got a single data center with multiple branch offices and you don't want the branch offices replicating between one another. You want everything to go back up to the main data center, right? But since we just have the two, we'll just do a full mesh, which should be fine. Here you can schedule it as well as limit the bandwidth, right? If you wanted to throttle it. You can schedule what times of day it's okay to do it. Maybe you only want it to happen at night, or something to that effect. But I think everything should be fine here. And then review, everything looks good, and we'll create. Luckily everything went through, so click close. So replication will not begin until the configuration is picked up by the member server of the replication group. So we may have to force a domain replication between DCs because, again, this is all this configuration is stored within AD. So let's go look at, let's just do this. So if we go // domain name slash namespace, and then folder. Here we're seeing files from DC02. Now I'm sure I was directed to DC02 because of the site. But if I go to DC03 and do the same thing, I should get redirected to DC03 because of the site again, right? Public HR. So there you go. I've been redirected to DC03, and apparently replication hasn't happened yet because I probably need to force replication within my domain sites here. So let me do that real quick. Let's see, so from DC02 to Elk Grove, let's try that, replicate now. No, that's not what I wanted it. Yeah, no, that's what I want. So it should pick it up and replication should start. We go back to DC01. And if we go down here, let's see if we've got anything we can look at. We can see that we've got 2 memberships within the replication group. It's got 1 item from the sending member. Okay, so now on DC03, the file's there. So if we look local, under data, under HR, it's the same, right? So if I add a new file here, or I'll just add a folder. Folder from DC03. And I go back to DC02 and I look there. Hopefully it's already replicated. Yeah, it's already done. So replication is pretty fast. Like I said, it got a lot more efficient with Windows Server 2008, just as the block level changes. So it's much easier on your WAN links between sites and things like that. So what else? That's pretty much it. So we can start talking about some best practices if you want. I did a bunch of research. I didn't find a whole lot of best practices as it relates to VMware specifically for DFS. But typically you install this on your domain controllers just because it's already got the service running, and why not host the namespace there as well, right? It's very, very low resource intensive. It doesn't take a lot of resources, CPU or memory. I read that a namespace server with a single CPU can essentially accommodate like tens of thousands of client referrals, a second, and it's not real impactful. The other thing I'll show you is if you go back to the namespace, or is it the folder? Let's look. If we go to properties, there's what's known as a cache. So if I'm a client and I request to get to a specific file server that's behind a namespace, I'm going to get referred by the namespace server, and I'm going to hold that referral in my cache for 300 seconds, which means if I'm continuously accessing the same file share, I don't have to keep going and saying, hey, point me to the right file share. I'm just going to remember that for 300 seconds. So you can up that if you want. Typically, the default is fine. But that is a performance mechanism because you shouldn't have to be constantly checking. It's almost like a DNS timeout, right? Let's see, let's go back to here. So there's, again, some tuning here, Microsoft best practices as far as tuning a namespace. It really doesn't play into vSphere at all. These are good blogs. I'll send these over. Now, as far as how many you need, you should at least have 2 namespace servers for availability and failover purposes. But again, it's really not for performance, right? A single namespace server can easily handle what you're going to have for almost any environment, unless it's an enormous organization, in which case you may want to have multiple. You would have multiple ones anyways, because you'll probably have multiple sites, and you just want to have that redundancy. So this is a good blog, though. It talks about where you should deploy it. Typically they say put it on the DCs just because it's easy and it's already there. The only reason you maybe wouldn't do that is if the teams that support Active Directory are separate from the teams that support your file sharing systems and things like that, right? But you can also install this on the file servers, right? That assumes you are using Windows file servers and they are members of the domain if you're using the domain integrated options. And again, it talks about some other scenarios here as well. So that's a good blog. Check that one out. There are some best practices as it relates to VMware, but I kind of attributed it back to just domain controllers and Active Directory in general, because most likely they're installing the namespaces on their Active Directory servers. So this, well, before I get into that, this document here is fantastic. It's pretty long. It's 106 pages, but it covers all sorts of things just in general to vSphere and setting up virtual machines on top of your infrastructure. So it's going to cover stuff like the hardware, ESX. It does get into the guest operating systems, which is where we'll focus first of all. Obviously, make sure you have a newer version of VM tools. I've seen it actually make a pretty big difference, having a newer version of tools and making sure that it's up to date. From a storage perspective, you definitely want to be using, again, talking about Windows here, you want to be using the Paravirtual SCSI adapter. You'll see much better performance with that. Let's see. From a network perspective, you should be leveraging the VMXNet3 driver or network adapter, right? For Windows, the newer versions of Windows at least. And then one other thing that this doc calls out that I've actually seen with one of my customers that has a virtualized Exchange environment is turning on receive side scaling within the guest operating system. So what that does is essentially, if you've got a VM with multiple CPUs or virtual CPUs, turning this on allows the NIC to put those transmit queues on multiple CPUs. Otherwise, it's all going to be tied to a single CPU, and it's really going to impact performance. You'll see a lot of drop packets. So like I said, my customer was having some performance issues with their Exchange environment, all virtualized, and I pulled in Deji, who is right here, Deji Yakamalafe. He is kind of our subject matter expert as it relates to virtualizing Microsoft applications. So he helped me, and he made some recommendations, kind of the things I'm talking about here, but turning on this receive side scaling, which I can show you where that is. So if we go to, let's say DC02, and we go to the network adapter, you're going to right click that, go to properties, and I don't think I have it turned on, but again, this is a lab, so who cares? Go to configure, advanced, and then scroll down to this receive side scaling. That should be enabled, and you'll see better performance. I'm not going to do it, but yeah, that is, and that's going to apply to basically any Windows, right? So definitely check that. And what else as far as best practices? So again, this doc is really good. It talks about sizing, of course, from a CPU perspective. Domain controllers really don't require a lot of resources from CPU and memory. So you're not going to have to worry about NUMA nodes and things like that, really. Just a couple CPUs is fine. So, but then as far as virtualizing Active Directory, this is a really good video. This is from VMworld 2 years ago. They talked about, what are some best practices on virtualizing that. A lot of it goes back to time synchronization, which can be challenging in an AD environment. So there is a good KB. Where did I put that KB? I think I put it in here, but I didn't bring it up. Yeah, disabling time synchronization. So basically the best practice recommendation now is to turn off time synchronization on your PDC emulator. And that's not enough though, because turning it off from the VMware tools perspective, there's still two scenarios where it's going to sync time with the host, and that's when it powers up or it vMotions, which can happen quite frequently, right? So if you absolutely want to turn that off, check out this KB, and there's some advanced settings you need to set on the VM itself to completely kill it, even when it vMotions or powers up, right? So, but essentially the best practice is you want to have your PDC emulator syncing with some external time source. You want to have your hosts syncing with that same one. So just use a common one, just be consistent, and you should be fine. Some other best practices from an Active Directory perspective would be, let's see, you don't want to be taking snapshots and rolling back, right? Because you get into those update sequence number rollback scenarios or USN rollbacks, and that's kind of, that can cause a lot of problems. It's gotten better in Windows Server 2012. They've put some safeguards in there, so it shouldn't be a problem, but again, you don't want to rely on that if you can help it. So don't clone, don't take snapshots and roll back. You can do those things under certain circumstances, but you really need to do your homework before you do it. And then the other best practice is, of course, having DRS rules, right? So if you've got multiple domain controllers or DFS namespace servers, hopefully they're the same servers, you want to set up some DRS rules so they're not all running on the same hosts, right? And that's pretty straightforward. You come in here, you would set up a new rule to say DFS, and we want to separate the virtual machines, and then you just pick your domain controller or your DFS namespace servers. I already have one here for my domain controllers, right? So that is a best practice, just so you're not going to have failures if a host fails, right? That's pretty much it. There's a couple good blogs here. This is actually a KB from Microsoft, so check that out if you want to know more about virtualizing Active Directory. And then these two, part 1 and part 2, these articles are from Matt Leibowitz, who jointly presented with Deji at this VMworld session. So a lot of good info there as well. And I put that in the doc here. I put it under VMware Resources because Dell EMC is kind of, we're all under the same umbrella. So, but I will put this in the TAM lab when I post a session as an attachment, so you can have access to this. Troy, is there anything I missed or anything I failed to mention or anything I got completely wrong?
No, it sounds great, Steve.
All right. Have you guys used DFS in the past? Anyone got any stories you'd want to tell, or what worked well or what didn't work well?
Steve, that comment that you made about snapshots and restores, yeah, that's definitely the case. I've run into that before, where if you try and use snapshots or backups and rollbacks, it does not like that at all.
Oh yeah, it's not pretty. There was another thing I was going to say. Don't P2V domain controllers either. Just spin up a new domain controller. It's way easier. And you can get into a lot of trouble if you P2V, and you get those update sequence numbers out of order and things go bad. Not fun. That was pretty much it. What else? Let's see. The other cool thing here is you can disable these folder targets. So if, let's say, that file server went down or it's having issues, you can turn it off so that clients aren't accessing it. So it's really, really helpful in migration scenarios, right? If I've got these two file servers, or this is my old file server, this is my new one, and I need to move all the data over to 3, but all my clients are accessing it through this namespace, they don't know any different, right? They're none the wiser, and there's no hiccups for them, because I'm sure you've all done those file migrations from an old server to a new one, and the path changes and all hell breaks loose. Your map drives don't work, all sorts of stuff. It can be painful. So it's a pretty cool technology. I actually like it. And I never used the replication before because we were doing NetApp, right? We would have NetApp at two different sites, and it would be doing the replication off of a separate replication network and everything. This is going to go over your primary LAN, I guess, right? So, but it works. It works pretty well for the small branch offices if you're not replicating tons of data. So, pretty cool though. And I think I can drag these around, yeah. So you can just change the folder structure if you want. But it's pretty flexible, pretty easy to set up. I mean, I'll probably tear all this down once we're finished here, and it's not going to really leave any impact in my lab. I'll just remove all the folders and delete the namespace, and pretty easy. You can set up multiple namespaces, by the way, right? So I set up public. You can have multiple ones. There's really no need to do that from a performance perspective. Everything's fine in a single namespace. The reason you may want to do that is just to delegate management if you've got different teams that manage those namespaces. So that may be a reason why you do it. Otherwise, there's no technical requirement that says you should create more than one namespace when you get to this limit or this scale, so to speak. That's pretty much all I got. We got 10 minutes left. Is there anything anyone wants to talk about? It doesn't have to be DFS. We could jump into anything.
Hey, Steve, I just want to thank you for setting this up and going through it. It's been very helpful.
You bet. Yeah, I hope it helps. But again, I'll send out all the links and I'll post it. So feel free to reuse it. All right. Well, if there's nothing else, I'll let you guys go. Thanks for joining.